back to another edition of Tips and Tricks. Today we're going to do a sound design breakdown, and I show you how I made all of this with my new plugin, Outgrowth. We're going to take a deep dive into each of these individual parts and just show you my thought process while I was designing them. Okay, the first part we're going to look at is this pad, and this is kind of how I started the piece. I knew that I wanted to use the radiate mode with a kind of complex sample. I wanted to choose something that had basically some chordal content to it. And so to accomplish that, the first thing I thought of was my friend Matt Lowry's bokeh sample packs. So the bokeh packs, pretty much all of them are these really dense like chordal samples, which I think can be really fun for that. Let me try to find the original so I can just play it really quick. So you can hear there's like a lot of stuff going on in this sample, obviously. And kind of altogether it implies this chord, but that means that kind of there are different notes and different, just different content throughout the entire sample. So I set up this sample to scan around. And if you want a deeper dive on the Radiate engine, I have another video for that I will link in the description. But I just wanted to kind of explore this sample through resynthesis. So really quick, maybe let's just hear kind of how the whole thing sounds. I can kind of do that like this. So with the window small, we're really exploring all of these different nooks and crannies in this sample. You can see I've set up jitter to move the start point in the window, and I've set up the LFO to just change the window width a little bit. And then from there, I decided to use just this really simple chord progression. I'm just playing a couple notes. I'm just holding one long one to get this kind of tonic, and then I just kind of go to a different note to change the chord, basically. So we go from like a D, or we go from an E up to a D to a B. And I'm just playing one note on the keyboard, and because this sample implies a chord, we kind of get this implicit chord progression. So the next thing I did was I dropped the filter down. So it's relatively low. At full, let's hear that. So there isn't actually a lot of high frequency content in the filter, but the reason I dropped that down was because I wanted to add a little bit of feedback. And I think the feedback control is kind of one of the like really unique unsung heroes in Outgrowth. The feedback basically just modulates the filter cutoff by the sound that's running through it. So by dropping the frequency a little bit and introducing feedback, we kind of get this kind of distortion almost that's targeted around the frequency of the filter. And then I just added a little bit of modulation on the feedback. You can see it here. It's a little bit of the LFO affecting that. And then I also added a bit of random per note onto the resonance, because the resonance kind of behaves and interacts in this interesting way with the feedback. So I just kind of wanted to create a bit more motion there. Here, I'll turn it up so you can really hear it. So just a little bit of resonance kind of brings out the feedback even more. And then other than that, I think this is just the basic pad preset for the ADSR, and I added a little bit of ripple and a little bit of smear. So that's kind of this underlying pad. And I think it's really interesting because, the MIDI sequence isn't that complex. It's just 3 notes being held for a long time. But with all of this motion, you kind of get something unique every time, and it kind of keeps this whole thing interesting. The next thing we have going on with Outgrowth is kind of this really spooky atmospheric stuff that's swimming around. I decided to use these samples by Christian Kruppa. They're all kind of really abstract synth samples. A lot of stuff generated with like tubes and feedback and modular. Here, I'll just play a few of them so you can get a sense. So a lot of like really interesting stuff in there. So I basically just like dragged a bunch of them into Outgrowth. And Outgrowth very kindly figured out whatever the pitch is in them. And then I just set it to round robin through them. So I'm kind of hearing a bunch of random ones. And then I just kind of played like sparse notes on the keyboard to just kind of get some atmosphere that's moving around. So let me flip over to stem for a second, just so we can kind of hear the original. So it's just like a bunch of noise that I really wanted to just kind of like throw in the background. And I wanted to make it a little bit more interesting. So a lot of these samples are really short. So I wanted to put them through Retain. And then if you don't already know, Retain is like a granular sustainer. And the grain size is affected by how large our window is for sustaining. So I used a pretty small window. And when combined with pretty short samples, we get this kind of glitchy result. So I just kind of buried all of that in the background. I have it sent to a reverb. Let's see if I can add that to. Here, I'll do this. Yeah, so just a lot of interesting kind of textures flying around. And like I said, I just kind of played some, random keys on the keyboard and kind of at an irregular loop length. So that stuff just kind of swims around while everything else is happening. And other than that, I didn't do very much. I dropped the filter a little bit. Let's see, I have a little bit of modulation on the feedback and the envelope. Just add a little bit more grit and motion. And then decent amount of ripple, decent amount of smear, just to kind of keep things moving again. It won't kind of sound like the same sample every time. There's like 10 in here anyway, so you might not even notice it repeating, but just to add a little bit more interest. So that's kind of buried underneath everything, which is really fun. And then finally, I have this little sporadic bassline just going on and kind of reinforcing the pad. So this is another sample by Christian. I will link it below. Um, and it's basically just this low bass note that sounds like this. And again, I didn't do a ton to this. I think what I really wanted to point out is that I chose reflect here as kind of a sustaining algorithm, because this original bass sample was pretty short and I kind of wanted it to ring out for a while, like you can hear. And reflect is interesting because it can operate kind of like this transparent sustainer, or it's a little bit more transparent than retain, because retain has all this granular stuff going on. So when it comes to bass lines, you might end up with like weird phase cancellation issues. So I like using reflect because it just kind of plays the sample back and forth. It's almost like a looper in this case. And it does add this kind of like, it does kind of add this seesaw effect, which I actually like in this context. If you want less of that, you could probably turn up subvert a little bit. But in this case, I kind of like that kind of weird pulsating going on in the background. So yeah, I just used reflect with as long a window as possible. I turned the filter down a little bit. And then as per usual, we've got a little bit of envelope, which always sounds good on a bass. A little bit of resonance and a little bit of feedback just to, really bring everything out. And then that I turned up the submerge a little bit, just to kind of keep all the notes relatively consistent. But other than that, I don't think there's actually any modulation on here. I didn't even need this. I will note that I explicitly took the default modulation, which is velocity. I took that off of the volume because I just wanted, because it's a bass, I wanted to make sure every note kind of hit just as hard. So let's hear that with the pad. And I really like this sample because it has a bit of like high-end grit to it in the upper frequency register, which is brought out even more by the feedback and the resonance, which is nice. Now let's hear that again with this kind of atmospheric synth as well. So that atmospheric synth is just kind of like hovering in the background, just providing vibe basically, but also kind of tried to time it such that it added punctuation to some of the notes, but not all of them. That is how I used Outgrowth for almost everything on this track. There's a little bit of Juno, there's a Juno arpeggio kind of holding it down on top of everything. But other than that, it's just Outgrowth and some reverb and delay. So I hope you liked this breakdown. I hope it was helpful in kind of thinking about how you could use Outgrowth to accomplish a few different things. And I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.